Welcome everyone to our first ever virtual EOL seminar. I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Professor Greg McFarquhar. Greg got all his degrees from the University of Toronto. He then moved on to California to the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in California as a postdoc. He then became an associate and a project scientist at NCAR. And then he moved on to become a full professor at the University of Illinois. He is since 2017 the director of the Cooperative Institute for Mesoscale Meteorological Studies and a professor at the School of Meteorology in Norman, Oklahoma. In between, he was also a visiting professor at the Blaise Pascal University in Clermont-Ferrand in France, and he was an advanced study program visiting scientist at NCAR again. Greg has published over 150 papers, which is very impressive. He is also a former chair of the American Meteorological Society Committee on Cloud Physics, and he is currently a vice president of the International Commission on Clouds and Precipitation. He is or was editor or chief editor of several high-profile journals. His main research interest is cloud physics, especially the basic properties of clouds, and he studies those with both observation and models. And this interest in observations has led him to participate or lead 25 field projects. And I think we will hear about some of them today. And so before we get started, because this is our first virtual seminar, I would like to mention that unfortunately, the only way to interact with Greg is through me. So if you have questions during the seminar, after the seminar, please email me. I will keep an eye on my email and I would be happy to pass your questions along to Greg. And you can find my email in the calendar invite. Melissa was kind enough to add it there. So please don't hesitate to ask questions to make this a little more interactive. And with that, yeah, I'm very much looking forward to your presentation, Greg.
Okay, thank you very much, Ulrike, for this kind invitation to speak in Boulder. And I'm sorry I'm not able to be there with you all today. It's always very nice to come out to Boulder, but I'm glad that I still have the opportunity to present this seminar. So today I would like to talk about some observations from some recent field campaigns that we conducted over the Southern Ocean, and in particular to talk about clouds, aerosol, and precipitation. Before I begin, I'd like to make special mention of the National Science Foundation and the Department of Energy that funded the research I'm going to present today. Well, I'm going to start off to show you some view graphs to show that supercooled liquid does definitely exist over the Southern Ocean. So we can see here on the nose cone of the G5, you can see some frozen droplets, some larger droplets that have hit on the cone, made its way backward, and frozen on the nose cone. And then I'm also showing here a picture of the forward-facing camera on the G5 on a flight we did over the Southern Ocean, seeing that it's become iced over. So this definitely shows that mixed phase clouds do indeed occur, and in fact, they occur quite regularly over the Southern Ocean. So some of the types of questions we'd like to know are things like what processes control the depth, amount, and longevity of supercooled water over the Southern Ocean? And does the fact that the Southern Ocean is such a pristine area, does this mean that the properties of these Southern Ocean clouds will differ from those over the Arctic? And then, because our field observations are necessarily over a short period of time, we also want to know if these short-term field observations can help inform remote sensing retrievals that will extend our observations to larger temporal and spatial scales. And then also we want to know how observations can aid in the development and evaluation of multi-scale modeling studies over the Southern Ocean. And I'm not going to be able to answer all these questions today, but I'd like to show you a little bit about these data sets so that we can know how we can use these data sets in the future to answer these questions? Well, in the past, we don't have regular observations of these supercooled water clouds over the Southern Ocean because the measurements there are quite infrequent because it's quite difficult to make these measurements. So here I'm showing a picture of the RV Investigator, one of the ships we used in our campaigns, after it had run aground in one of the Australian Antarctic research stations. And you can see that it's a fairly hostile environment that makes it very difficult to make these ship and air-based observations. And before I go into detail to talk about these projects, I'd like to acknowledge a wide number of individuals who I've collaborated with in the analysis of these data in the field campaigns. And the list is so numerous, I'm not going to go through them by name in order that I have time to actually talk more about some of the scientific results that I'm going to present today. So as by means of an outline, I'm first of all going to talk about a motivation for these observational campaigns over the Southern Ocean. And then I'm going to describe a little bit just an overview of some of the campaigns that we conducted over the Southern Ocean in the 2018 timeframe. And then I'm going to show some preliminary results in 3 different sections. First of all, talking about characterization of aerosols, cloud condensation nuclei, and ice nucleating particles, both at the surface, boundary layer, and free troposphere. Then I'll move and talk about remote sensing observations using satellite, ground, and ship-based platforms. And then I'll finish a little by talking about our in-situ cloud observations and those of precipitation. So in terms of a motivation, the Southern Oceans are actually one of the cloudiest regions on Earth. And the Earth's climate, the whole climate over the whole planet, is quite sensitive to how we represent these Southern Ocean clouds. So for example, this can have an impact on the global energy budget. It can impact the cloud feedbacks that we get out of our models, and even can affect carbon cycle feedbacks and how it interacts with climate change. Through teleconnection, there's an impact on the tropical rainfall belts. And further, since the Southern Ocean surrounds the Antarctic, there is an interaction of the Southern Ocean with the ice shelves whose stability to climate change is poorly known. And then another interesting thing is the fact that the Southern Ocean is so unique on the planet. It's very remote from anthropogenic and natural continental aerosol sources. This makes it a unique test bed for trying to understand cloud aerosol interactions in both liquid, ice, and mixed phase clouds. And in fact, some earlier studies by Gahn and Carslaw in 2012 pointed out that one of the largest uncertainties in determining aerosol indirect effects in climate models is our poor understanding of what is the pre-industrial state, which is probably best represented by the Southern Ocean. So in terms of a specific motivation for this project, here I'm showing a view graph that shows the absorbed shortwave radiation mean air from the CMIP-5 models, where the red colors, which are predominant in the Southern Ocean, indicates that too much shortwave radiation is being absorbed by the Earth's system. This most likely is associated with the fact that there is not enough reflection of shortwave radiation by the clouds. And these biases can influence the circulation and can correlate with climate sensitivity. We believe that these biases occur because clouds, particularly low and mid-level clouds, are poorly represented in general circulation models and numerical weather prediction models. And we believe that this is due to the fact that the models underestimate the presence of supercooled water, perhaps because these clouds are so much more pristine than equivalent clouds in the Arctic oceans. And further, if you look at cyclone compositing from the models that make up the CMIP-5, you can see that if you look at the patterns of this cyclone composites and you compare the air in this bias for warm, moist airs compared to cold, dry airs, you can see that this red color is predominantly in the cold, dry regions of the cyclones. So this meant that we felt in order to understand the reasons for these biases, we had to make a lot of observations in these cold, dry areas of the cyclones, and also in the summer where some of these biases are greater. And again, I emphasize that the clouds over the Southern Ocean can very differ from those over the Northern Hemisphere, which makes a lot of the parameterizations that go into these models. So we really haven't had the adequate data to develop these parameterizations of cloud processes. Now, I've mentioned that the supercooled water is very frequent over the Southern Ocean, and some past satellite studies have suggested this. Here I'm showing a diagram from Choi et al., which are showing the fraction of clouds at -20 degrees Celsius that contain supercooled water. And again, look over the Southern Ocean area, we can see a preponderance of this red color, showing there's a lot of supercooled liquid water over the Southern Ocean. And this is very important because GCMs have a lot of sensitivity to how the water is partitioned into liquid and ice clouds. And in fact, Jennifer Kay has done some past studies showing that if we artificially increase the amount of water that is supercooled water over these Southern Ocean clouds, some of this bias disappears. But at the same time, the reasons for doing this partitioning or different partitioning over the Southern Ocean was not well understood. Well, we can't just use these satellite data necessarily at face values because there can be a lot of uncertainty in the satellite phase determination. So for example, here I'm showing the temperature on the horizontal axis and the relative fraction of different phases on the vertical axis. And if a lot of times these satellites only determine information about the cloud top phase. But it's also interesting to note that there's a large uncertainty in this light white color here on what is the phase in the region of temperatures between about 0 and -25 degrees Celsius, which in the Southern Ocean corresponds to altitudes of about 1 to 3 kilometers, which is our region of interest. And this occurs, we have these difficulties because of the cloud edges that occur over the Southern Ocean, the fact that there's thin clouds and multi-layered clouds, and sometimes a very low solar zenith angle. So we can't necessarily rely entirely on satellite data. And another interesting thing that we've noted from past studies is a large seasonal cycle in the cloud microphysical properties. So this plot here shows concentration of either CCN or cloud droplets on the vertical axis as a function of month. So if you look at the winter months that are shadowed in gray and compare to the southern months in white, you see that typically both the concentrations of cloud condensation nuclei that were measured at Cape Grim are larger in the summer compared to the winter, and also the retrieval of cloud droplet number concentrations from MODIS are also exhibiting larger concentrations in the summer over the winter. So this points out the need for observations over a complete seasonal cycle. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk about 4 different projects that were part of an international collaboration that were developed to try and look at the properties of Southern Ocean clouds. There are 4 main themes. One is to document the synoptically varying vertical structure of Southern Ocean boundary layers and clouds. The second theme is to look at the variability in sources and sinks of aerosols, cloud condensation nuclei, and ice nucleating particles, including looking at the role of local biogenic sources over different seasons. To get a better characterization of the supercooled liquid clouds that occur over the Southern Ocean, both their characteristics and processes responsible for its formation, and also to do better retrievals of the properties of mixed phase clouds so that these field data can be extended to longer time and spatial periods. And I also want to emphasize that because climate modeling motivated a lot of this experiment, for the data to have a broad impact on climate modeling, it was important to bring in the modeling community from the very beginning of the project design so that we could collect the data in a way that would allow for systematic confrontation of the leading climate models. So with that in mind, I'm now going to switch and talk about our observations of our experiments. And I'm going to introduce these 4 different experiments that were each unique, but had a lot of synergy between the different components. So all of the observations were collected in the 2018 time period in this north-south curtain that extended south of Tasmania all the way to the Antarctic. And the 4 different experiments were SOCRATES, which was conducted in January and February of 2018, involving the deployment of the National Science Foundation NCAR G-V aircraft. We also had the CAPRICORN experiment that had 2 separate cruises, one in 2016 and one in 2018, which involved cruises of the Australian Research Investigator. We also had the MICRE experiment, which was based here on Macquarie Island, which involved the installation of instruments from the US Department of Energy on the Australian Bureau of Meteorology being installed on an Australian Bureau of Meteorology station at Macquarie Island. And then finally, we also had the Marcus experiment, which involved the installation of the Department of Energy Mobile Facility 2 on the Australian icebreaker Aurora Australis as it made resupply voyages from Hobart, Tasmania to the 4 different Australian research stations in the Antarctic. So to visualize what was actually sampled on these experiments, I'm seeing a figure here that Christina McCluskey put together for us. And what we're showing here is, in the yellow color, we're showing all the tracks that the SOCRATES missions flew. The dark blue and light blue are showing the voyage tracks of the Capricorn voyages. The star indicates the location of Macquarie Island, and the green colorings here illustrate the different Marcus cruises. And on the bottom, you can see the timeline that was occupied, seeing that we had a lot of the observation concentrating in the summer months between January to March, but it's also important to note that Marcus extended into the fall and spring seasons, and the MICRE campaign gave us a complete seasonal cycle of observations. So now I'll move on and talk about the different experiments. And I'll start by talking about SOCRATES. SOCRATES used the G-V, and it sampled clouds, aerosols, and precipitation from Hobart to within 400 miles of the Antarctic. There were 15 research flights conducted, representing 118 flight hours. 4 of the flights were over the research vessel Investigator and 2 over Macquarie Island for synergy with both MICRE and Capricorn. And during the course of the experiment, we released 109 dropsondes. We had a complete remote sensing and in-situ payload on the G-V aircraft, involving a complete set of cloud probes that covered size distributions and bulk properties over the complete range of particle sizes. We had a radar, W-band, that gave reflectivity, Doppler velocity, and spectra. We had a high spectral resolution LiDAR with polarization, which was useful for detecting mixed phase and supercooled clouds. We had dropsondes, as I mentioned. We had aerosol packages, which, although concentrating on giving total concentration and size resolved aerosols, also did have some collections for analysis of residual aerosols and biological aerosols. And then we also had our standard state probes, along with some other probes such as the forward cameras, radiometers, and measurements of humidity. So to schematically illustrate where these probes were located, here I'm showing the top of the G-V with the humidity, radiometers, and the CCN and CN devices. On the right wing, you can see a lot of the microphysical probes for measuring cloud properties, and also the HCR radar probe, and also a bulk probe for measuring the bulk water, the CLH2, and a Rosemount icing detector for measuring the amount of supercooled water, along with our 2DC, CDP, and PIP for measuring size-resolved cloud distributions. On the left wing, we had aerosol probes such as the UHSAS, other cloud probes such as the 2DS and FIPS, a King probe for bulk water, a Gust probe for turbulence, and a ballast to accommodate for the fact that we had the heavy HCR on the other wing. And then on the bottom of the plane, we had the CVI, measurements of bulk water and also aerosol residuals. We had radiometers, viewports for some of the remote sensing instruments, an auto GNI, which Jan Jensen looked after, and a CFDC for ice nucleating particles. Basically, in terms of how we flew during SOCRATES, we would typically take off out of Hobart. We would ascend to a high altitude where we would release dropsondes to trace out a thermodynamic curtain. We would also remotely measure the clouds with the radar and LiDAR, and this would also give us an idea of what type of measurements we might want to pursue on the way back to Hobart. When we got to about 62 degrees south, we would drop down into the boundary layer. We would execute series of legs flying through clouds, doing ramp descents and descents through clouds, doing measurements of legs underneath clouds, making measurements of free tropospheric aerosols, and when possible, going over the Investigator or Macquarie Island, never on the same flight. And in general, we always took the same path out and back because this gave us more time. So we would wait till the very last minute when the pilots would tell us we would have to ascend to higher altitude in order to have sufficient time to get back to Hobart. Well, I also like to mention the other projects. Marcus used the Aurora Australis. This is the ship that I showed in the first slide of the experiment after it had been fixed up after its mishap in the Australian Antarctic station of Casey. And what we did is here we put a lot of instruments on this ship so that we basically littered the monkey deck with a series of different probes of everything you could imagine. And we also had things such as a radar, which was on the other side of the ship, which I'm not showing here. It was put on a stabilized platform because there could be a lot of listing of the ship as it's going over the Southern Ocean. We also had a LiDAR, ceilometer, and a radar wind profile. In terms of passive remote sensing, you're seeing a lot of the instruments on the monkey deck here, things like an ARRI, a microwave radiometer, infrared thermometer, and total sky imager. We also had a lot of in-situ aerosols. Again, I'm not actually showing them here. They're using the ARM aerosol observing system, which gave information on things like size distributions, optical properties, and absorption. And Paul DeMott was also helping with some measurements of ice spectrometers. And then we had measures of our standard gases and meteorological measurements. For MICRE, we installed a number of equipment on the MacQuarieIsland Bureau of Meteorology site. This included the instruments in green, which were provided by the Department of Energy, including up and down welling, surface, broadband, shortwave, and longwave fluxes, ceilometers, microwave radiometers for liquid water path, MFRSRs, Parseval for measuring raindrop size distributions, as well as a sun photometer. And then there was also instruments from other investigators, such as a W-band Doppler LiDAR. The Australian Antarctic Division had a polarization LiDAR, a ceilometer from the University of Canterbury, aerosol filter samples from CSU, and measurements of aerosols and CCN as well as twice daily radiosondes. And then the final project that I want to mention is Capricorn. There were two different phases. Capricorn 1 is summarized in a paper by Mace and Protat in 2018. They had distrometers, microwave radiometers, a cloud radar, a LiDAR, and a micro rain radar. Unfortunately, the dual pole C-band Doppler radar did not work in this campaign. And then they also did another campaign at the same time as Socrates called Capricorn 2. It had all the instruments from Capricorn 1. In addition, the C-band dual polarization radar did work. And then there was a number of instruments supplied by National Science Foundation, including radiosonde launches every 6 hours, the NCAR 915 megahertz wind profiler, a LiDAR ceilometer, and a vertically pointing Doppler LiDAR. So another advantage of Capricorn 2 is it went much further south than Capricorn 1. Capricorn 1 stayed north of the oceanic polar front, whereas Capricorn 2 went further further south to the colder waters. And this is illustrated here, outlining the synergy between the projects, where I have the latitude plotted on the horizontal axis, the hours per degree of latitude plotted on the vertical axis. It's done on a logarithmic scale because, of course, we had less aircraft data with Socrates. But what you can see is, given that the mean position of the polar front is probably around -58 or so, that we had a lot of observations, both from Capricorn, Marcus, and Socrates, that got well south of the position of the oceanic polar front. And all campaigns have advantages. MICRE had a very long sample, 2 years worth. Capricorn made more detailed oceanographic, aerosols, and surface flux measurements than the other campaigns. Marcus made observations poleward of 60 degrees south and all the way in the ice sheet that went further south than that of Capricorn. And they also have observations of seasonal cycles, whereas the aircraft observations from Socrates give process studies and remote sensing evaluation. So that is an outline of the different projects. And now I'd like to move in the second half of my seminar to talk about preliminary results. And I'll pause just for a second to let Ulrike let me know if there's been any questions or pressing questions as of yet.
So far, no questions.
Okay, well, let's move in and go right to the preliminary results. And I've arranged this in 7 different sections. And I want to emphasize that the majority of the observations I'm showing and results that I'm showing today were not performed by me, but by a wide range of collaborators who work together on a SOCRATES team. So we'll talk about surface aerosol observations, then we'll step up in the atmosphere to look at the boundary layer and free troposphere. Then we'll take a look at the ice nucleating particle data, finally talking about clouds, starting with the large scale picture with satellite. Then we'll move to ship and ground-based remote sensing, and then we'll move to in situ measurements. So first of all, in terms of surface aerosols, we can use this to try and give us information about what controls the number and composition of aerosol observations. So here I'm showing some data that Martin Schneider and Paul DeMott and others have supplied us with. And here I've got the particle concentration plotted on the vertical axis, where black represents all particles and the green represents fluorescent biological aerosol particles that are derived from 3 channels from the VIPS-4 instruments. And what I also want to point out is the difference in scales. That note that the black numbers are much higher than the green numbers. And the green are showing the fluorescent particles. And what you're showing is that the biological particles only represent about 3 plus or minus about 10% of the mean for aerosol particle sizes between about 0.8 and 13 microns. So it's giving an idea of the importance of these biological particles associating, say, with the dimethyl sulfide over the Southern Ocean. So another interesting question was, well, how does this relate to latitude? So what they also did is plotting the number concentration on a logarithmic scale here as a function of latitude, the green again representing the biological particles and the black representing the total particles. What you see is that the latitudinal dependence reveals a strong dependence on the particle concentration, with a minimum around -56 latitude for the total concentrations, with the total particle concentrations increasing to the north and south during Marcus, whereas there wasn't quite as much variation in the biological particles. So we need to begin to investigate why this is the case. Now, Marcus having a bit more of a limited cycle with only 4 cruises, it might be a function of where we went and where the blooms actually were. It might be a function of the meteorological conditions sampled, since we had no control over where the ship went because it was resupply voyages, but that's the type of work that is continuing. So moving up into the boundary layer, I'd like to show you some analysis from Cindy Toohey and the CVI, where here I'm showing results for 6 different flights that are illustrated in the horizontal axis, and I'm showing the fraction of the total aerosol amounts in different types, such as sulfur-containing, sea spray, and other types, as illustrated by the different colors. Here I'm showing results from aerosols that were sampled 150 meters above the ocean, representing particle sizes between about 0.1 and 5 microns. And these particles were stored frozen for later analysis by transmission electron microscopy and X-ray spectroscopies. And what you can see that these size measurements for these flights were primarily dominated by sulfur-based particles, which were primarily biogenically produced sulfuric acid. Whereas the second most common particle type was salt-based sea spray, which made up about 28%. So focusing a little bit more on what were the actual compositions of the sea spray, here I'm showing all 6 flights combined, where I can take a look at this 28% and see what types of sea spray it actually was. And you can see that the sea spray was dominated by unprocessed sodium chloride-based sea spray particles. And also many of these large sea spray particles had detectable carbonaceous coatings, which may be important for ice nucleation. So Cindy and her collaborators are continuing to look more in detail about the types of conditions that were sampled and what caused the variation between these different flights and how it relates to meteorological and cloud conditions. Well, I'd like to move on and show some results from Kevin Sanchez and Greg Roberts, who have analyzed some of the cloud condensation nuclei observations. So here I'm showing the CCN number on the vertical axis as a function of the supersaturation on the horizontal axis, because these CCN counters were measured in a mode where there was multiple samples at different supersaturations. There was also one counter that ran continuously at 0.4% supersaturation. Well, what Greg and Kevin have done is they've divvied up these numbers, the CCN spectra, into 4 different clusters using a k-means clustering. And the clusters are associated with a bimodality in both the CN and CCN concentrations. So the different colors represent low CN and low CCN, or low CCN and high CCN, or etc. High CN, high CCN, and then finally the black is high CN and low CCN. The division between the low and high CN was at approximately 750 particles per cubic centimeter, but it was dependent on supersaturation for the CCN. So what Greg and Kevin did is they wanted to give an idea about what could be the source of origin for these different clusters. So what they did is they ran some high split back trajectories to try to explain this variability. And I'll remind you what the different colors represent in this legend here, and I'm showing some of the results from their high split back trajectories. So basically the low CN and high CCN conditions are mainly coming from southerlies, which were probably influenced by the Antarctic coastal biological productivity. On the other hand, observations with high CN, whether they were low CCN or high CCN, are predominantly from westerlies. And these may be characteristics of RPF, or recent particle formation, because they have low accumulation mode concentrations that give the low CCN here. And then the blue is very similar to the black, with the exception that there may have been longer periods or less precipitation, so that there was a longer time period for condensational growth to give higher values of CCN. And then on the other hand, the low CN and low CCN events, they were mainly events where the aerosols were scavenged by precipitation, and hence you don't see results of recent particle formation. So to continue exploring that recent particle formation, I'd like to show you some results that Isabel McCoy, Rob Wood, and Chris Bretherton have been working on using some measurements from the G-V during SOCRATES of free tropospheric aerosol measurements. And basically the conclusion of their studies is that recent particle formation events are quite common in the free troposphere. So what I'm showing here is some results from the G-V, where I have latitude on the horizontal axis. And what we're showing here is some measures of high CN values that are circled here, and that are occurring at a time period where we had very low concentrations that were measured in the accumulation mode between 100 and 1,000 microns by the UHSAS, the ultra-high sensitivity aerosol spectrometer. And because of these differences in concentrations, we can be quite sure that these high CN are associated with high Aitken concentrations. It's interesting to note the high spatial variability that you can get in these concentrations, which was something was very striking to me when I was flying on the G-V. And what Isabel and her collaborators have been working on is showing that these intermittent gas to particle conversion events in an environment with low surface area have been causing this RPF events. And they've noted that these particles are largely composed of H2SO4, which is a prominent precursor gas from phytoplankton emissions in the Southern Ocean. And interesting enough, they only found one case of this RPF in the boundary layer, which is never, even though the precursor gases were present there, but large sea spray aerosol particles were appearing from the wind. So these different colors that I'm noting here correspond to some high split back trajectories that Isabel and her collaborators also did to try to trace the origin of some of these RPF events. So say looking at this light blue color, we can look at the results of some of their high split back trajectories, where here I have altitude on the vertical axis and age on the horizontal axis. And what you can show that is a lot of these RPF events tend to be associated with a warm conveyor belt from west of Australia that is propagating to the southeast. And further, they showed that there was a lot of rapid cyclonic ascent and descent associated with convection and precipitation. And if this occurs 20 to 30 hours before the sampling, it can cleanse some of the accumulation mode aerosol, but not the H2SO4, setting the stage for this RPF. And then the timing and the precipitation, hence, affects the numbers of some of our CN and CCN events. So moving on in this very quick tour of Southern Ocean observations, unfortunately, I don't have time to discuss any of these observations in detail. I'd like to take a look at some of the work that Paul DeMott, Thomas Hill, and Catherine Moore have been working on as relates to what controls CINP concentrations, namely ice nucleating particle concentrations over the Southern Ocean. So Paul had a lot of instruments in the various different ships and also in the aircraft. And here I'm going to be showing some results from some of his ship analysis. They were making INP concentrations at -20°C as collected by the Colorado State University Ice Spectrometer that measures immersion freezing spectra on bulk aerosol samples that are collected onto polycarbonate filters. And if you take a look at some of these observations over the Southern Ocean, the color here is corresponding to the ice nucleating particle concentration. The different symbols represent the different campaigns. And you can see that there's a reasonable amount of variability that's being shown here. But in general, the ice nucleating particle concentrations are quite a bit lower than some of the earlier observations from Bigg in his study of 1973. Even though there's a bit of a weak dependence on latitude, we could say that probably the highest concentrations are appearing on land and especially closer to Australia. So Paul and his collaborators are continuing to look at these data to try and better understand what is causing some of these differences. So now I'd like to move in the last 15 minutes or so and talk about clouds. And I'm going to start by talking about satellite remote sensing. So I'm going to start by showing some data from the Himawari satellite, which is a very nice satellite that's giving a unique look at Southern Ocean clouds. And I'm going to be showing some work here from E. Huang, Steve Sims, and some of their collaborators. So what I'm going to show is the frequency of occurrence of different cloud types here, plotted as a function of cloud top temperature on the horizontal axis. And this is for all observations from Himawari on a rectangular box that is bounding the limits of all of the 15 SOCRATES flights. And what I want to draw your attention to is this blue line here that shows the prevalence of supercooled liquid water at temperatures between about 0 and -25°C during the time period of our SOCRATES flights. So it shows that we are getting a lot of detection of supercooled water, maybe more than actually what we saw in some of the SOCRATES observations, but it shows the information that we can get from the satellite remote sensors, and hence we can use the airborne data to try and understand the processes controlling the amount, longevity, and prevalence of supercooled water. But I also want to point out that satellite sensing is not necessarily totally great. So here I'm showing some result that Simon Alexander and his collaborators have been working on, which is a comparison of satellite and ship retrievals. So on the left-hand side here, I have as a function of height, I have the hydrometeor occurrence fraction for different colors, showing the results we get from the total in the black, radar only, LiDAR only. And then what you see is you see that there is quite a large fraction report occurrence of clouds occurring at 500 meters in the ship-based remote sensing in Capricorn. But if you compare it to the plot on the right that shows the satellite remote sensing using the Dardar algorithm from the CloudSat, again showing radar, LiDAR, and total in black, what you see is that there is a dearth of these clouds right at 500 meters that we're seeing in the ship retrievals that we don't show in the satellites. So it's showing a limitation of the satellites, especially for some of these lower clouds that may not be well detected, and also noting that satellite may just be detecting the top of the clouds and not lower down levels. So we do need to take a look at ship and ground-based remote sensing. So one thing we've done with Marcus, we had a number of different instruments that were able to remotely sense the properties of the clouds. So what my graduate student Sai Ding and myself did is we wanted to try and better understand what could cause the variation in some of the liquid cloud properties. So using the data from all of the Marcus cruises, we developed a value-added product that would describe the meteorological conditions of all of the ship-based measurements. So it would include things like sea surface temperature, cloud-based temperature, whether the clouds were precipitating or not, whether they were coupled or decoupled to the surface layer, whether we were north or south of the oceanic polar front, the air mass origin as dictated by high split trajectory analysis, and the location relative to the cyclone, because we thought this would help us better understand the controls of supercooled water. So as an example of her analysis, here I'm showing how we define the location relative to the cyclone system. So if we knew the location of the ship, and we knew the location of the nearest center of the nearest cyclone, we could calculate the distance of the ship away from the cyclone center and also its angle to tell us which sector we were in, whether we were in the warm sector or the cold dry sector. So SciSci has been doing a lot of analysis with this, and I want to just show you one result from her. And that is here, we're taking a look at the subset of the data where we're only looking at single layer clouds that were non-precipitating, that had bases less than 3 kilometers, and that were more than 500 kilometers from the nearest cyclone center, so that we're not getting a lot of influence of our frontal systems. And what we're showing is how a number of properties varied depending whether we were south or north of 60 degrees south as an approximate location, maybe the oceanic polar front. And if you take a look at these results, what you see right away is the average cloud-based temperature that is shown here. It's about -10 degrees Celsius south of 60 degrees Celsius, which is quite a bit colder than that which we're seeing north of 60 degrees Celsius. But if you take a look at the liquid water paths in this plot here, you can see that even though the liquid water paths are a bit lower than, say, the average liquid water paths north of the oceanic polar front, there's still quite a bit of liquid water path here, with the red line representing the median of the distribution, the blue lines, the 25 and 75 percentiles of the distribution, and the other distributions giving the outliers. So there is indeed extensive supercooled liquid water extensive south of the polar front, even though that we're finding that there's a lot less precipitable water south than north of the polar front. We've also been taking a look at the CCN. We've been seeing a lot of seasonal cycles in the CCN and the retrieved cloud droplet number concentrations, which seem to peak in December, and they also appear to be a bit larger south of the oceanic polar front than north of the oceanic polar front. So we're continuing to explore these type of observations. We also had remote sensors on board the aircraft. So here I'm going to show some results from the HSRL LiDAR. And what I want to point out is here on one of our flights from January 16, I want to point out if you look at this upper plot that shows the volume depolarization ratio, there's very low values that are indicative of supercooled water. And if you look at the lower plot, which shows the backscatter coefficient, you can see that these supercooled water clouds are occurring in quite thin layers with a lot of supercooled water. And you don't always see multiple layers, even if they're occurring at different altitudes, because you're not typically seeing the ocean surface here because the LiDAR can be occulted. So based on that, we can use some of the in-situ observations to tell us a little bit more about the processes producing these supercooled water. And Ulrike, how am I doing? Any questions or pressing points yet?
No, we are still waiting for the first questions.
Okay, well, maybe they'll come in the question period. So I'll finish my results here, and then we'll move on to the question period. So first thing is the cloud droplet number concentration on the vertical axis here as a function of cloud condensation nuclei. These different colors are corresponding to the different regimes of Greg Roberts and Kevin Sanchez again. What you see is that the CCN concentrations that were made, say, at 0.3% supersaturation, they seem to correlate quite well with the overlying cloud droplet number concentration. This illustrates the importance of aerosols and cloud microphysics. But it's also interesting to note the very large variability in both the CCN concentrations and on the cloud droplet number concentrations that we got in this campaign. In fact, they were a bit larger than what I thought. I was expecting that more of the values might be smaller given the pristine nature. So we need to try and explore this a little more. So Jun-Shuk who used to work with me as a research scientist, who's now at Pusan University, has been exploring this using some of the ramp descents and descents of the G5 during the experiment. So here we have altitude plotted on the vertical axis, the cloud droplet number concentration on the horizontal axis. And what you can see by looking at this plot is there can be an incredible variation of the cloud droplet number concentration depending upon which one of these ramp descents and descents we were flying. So if you look at one of the spirals in brown, sorry, not spirals, but ramp descent in brown with very low concentrations, you can see it was conducted when the wind speeds were quite low. And if you look at some of the cases with higher surface wind speeds, like the one in red, it had higher wind speeds that were measured, such as here. But there are also differences. If you look at this case in the green, it had very low winds, very high wind speeds, yet the cloud droplet number concentrations were quite low. So Jun is continuing to look into this, and a lot of this can be explained depending upon the coupling of the surface layer with the cloud layer, hence giving some information about the role of sea spray. We've also, it's also interesting to note that the determination of phase from the in-situ observations, just like it is from remote sensing, it's not necessarily straightforward. So here is a diagram that my graduate student, John D'Alessandro, has put together, showing how he uses data from all the different in-situ probes to derive phase. And I'm not going to go through the details of this diagram, but I'll point out that the Rice probe and the cloud droplet probe give a lot of information about the smaller particles and their phase, whereas the larger particles are determined both from Emma Yarvin and Svip's Halo probes, and also information from the 2DS probe. So what John has been doing is he's been developing a machine learning method to try and identify what is the phase of these large particles using a set of data that he uses to train it, such as measurements of crystals, ice crystals here, Graupel here, and cloud droplets here. And then he's come up with a number of different variables that describe the measurements from the in-situ probes, such as the total concentration, mass, and dispersion of the size distributions. And he's using that to generate a machine learning method for determining the phase. Not going through the details, I would like to show you the results though. Here I have the probability of occurrence of different phases from the in-situ observations on the vertical axis, temperature on the horizontal axis, with red showing liquid, mixed, and ice only, and the black is showing the number of cases. So you can see there's very few cases at -35 here, so don't get too excited about the results there. But the most important thing is, again, we're seeing a very large frequency of supercooled liquid water from -20 to 0 degrees Celsius. But note that we're also getting some ice phase from about -5 to 0 that we're seeing. I think I have time for one last result. So I'd like to show you some result from Yang Wang, who's been looking and trying to better understand what's generating some of these supercooled water, looking at some generating cells. So the American Meteorological Society defines a generating cell as a small region of locally enhanced reflectivity at cloud top from which enhanced reflectivity trails characteristic of falling snow originates. So here we're showing some of the HCR data and showing a lot of these cloud generating cells and the emanating reflectivity streaks. And here I'm showing a picture that Joe Finland took on one of the G5 flights, where you can see some of these generating cells that are popping out of sort of the stratocumulus deck, showing that there is a lot of spatial inhomogeneity. So what Yang Wang did is he went through and developed a method where he found all of the cases where we had measurements of in-situ microphysics near the top of the cloud. So we had collocated HCR data, and then he had identified the generating cells by the prominence in the reflectivity field as greater than 4 dBz's, as shown by these gray lines. And then he compared in a statistical basis how the microphysical properties varied depending upon whether the observations were made inside or outside of the generating cells. Some of his interesting results, he found that the mean generating cell width was only about 400 meters, which is narrower than was found in previous studies for Arctic clouds and mid-latitude clouds. but he did find that the total droplet number concentration, as illustrated here, and again, we have box and whisker plots, the mean, the outliers of the distribution, and the 25 and 75 percentiles. He found that the droplet number concentration was greater in the generating cells in pink than outside the generating cells, as was the liquid water content and the total ice water content. They were consistently larger inside the generating cells compared to outside, suggesting that, but also noting that the differences were maybe not as large as what we might have expected, because the mixing with the small scales here, the turbulent mixing, may be acting to minimize the difference between the generating cells and areas outside the generating cells. But nevertheless, just like our previous studies, this suggests that the generating cells are providing a favorable environment for growth by deposition and riming, like we previously observed. Supercooled water is also important for assessing the potential hazard induced by aircraft icing. So I think Jeff took these pictures. Here's a nose cone during a G5 encounter with small supercooled liquid water droplets, sizes less than 50 microns, as compared to a case where we had larger supercooled liquid water droplets, greater than 75 microns, or supercooled drizzle. And in these cases, ice is impacting and freezing further back on the pod, showing a potential impact on the wing and other important control areas of the aircraft. So this is an interesting project. So Julie Haggerty, Corey Wolf, and myself decided to collaborate in trying to better understand how these areas are predicted. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over that plot here. And this is some results that a couple of undergraduate students at the University of Oklahoma, Ethan Schaefer and Julia Shima, have been working on. And what they did is they took all of the data from the G5 flights and plotted them here. So here the gray is showing the G5 flight tracks. Gray is showing where there's no supercooled water. Black is showing where there is supercooled water. And the purple or pink color is showing where there's supercooled liquid drizzle. And they compared that with the location of the SIGMETs that were issued by the Australian Bureau of Meteorology with the access model. And they found only 3 cases, such as the green color here, where we have overlap between the SIGMET and the in-situ observations, had overlap between the in-situ observations with the SIGMETs, and many cases had no overlap. However, note that some of the cases we may not have flown into these SIGMETs. So in the summer, they're going to continue to look at these data using some more of the remote sensing observations, and also working with Julie to look at some of her icing products. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over these results of Sonia Lasher-Trapp on secondary ice nucleating production, because I'd like to summarize by saying that we have unique sets of Southern Ocean data on clouds and aerosols now available, consisting of 15 different G5 research flights, 4 voyages of the Aurora Australis, 2 years of data at MacQuarie-Island, and 2 cruises of the Investigator. All of these data are in the public domain, but we highly encourage people to work with those who collected the data in collaborative studies, because we can help you understand some of the caveats. And I think I'm preaching to the choir when I'm talking to EOL on that point there. In terms of initial findings, we found pristine environments with numerous small and few large aerosols above clouds. This is suggestive of new particle formation and long-range transport from continents. Very few ice nucleating particles. High concentrations of aerosols over the ocean, especially where winds are intense. We found ubiquitous supercooled liquid water in thin multi-layered clouds with small-scale generating cells near cloud top. And we found a lot of variability of cloud properties in CCN that are associated with aerosols and meteorological conditions that we're further exploring. And I've got to have one slide to talk about the future. And I want to start thinking about SOCRATES too. We've got a great set of data we're going to continue to work on, but inevitably it takes us 3 to 4 years to put together a new project. And I think there are enough questions that we will want a SOCRATES too. What will be different? I think we'll want to go in an alternate season. I think we'll want to explore observations in a transition season, such as when the blooms are increasing in intensity. And I think we'll want to go there where there's a greater variability in the blooms over the course of the project. Also, I think that SOCRATES 1 was really an Eulerian experiment. We were just sampling what was there and getting an idea about what was there. I think Socrates 2, we might want to apply more of a Lagrangian approach, where we'll want to trace how the clouds evolve on different days in subsequent flights as they move into blooms or move away from blooms and so on. And I think we'd also like observations closer to the Antarctic. I'm not sure whether you guys would want to work out of the Antarctic, but one thing that I did mention to Jeff, and maybe this would be a possibility, is to do suitcase flights to the Antarctic, where a skeleton crew is kept at the Antarctic, and we do a flight down to the Antarctic and then leave the Antarctic the next day. Also, it would be great to have 2 aircraft for coincident remote sensing in situ observations. Make more comprehensive data on the aerosol chemical properties would be nice, and which is maybe if you use the G-5 for remote sensing and the C-130 for the in situ might be possible. And then I think holographic observations would have strengthened the cloud data. So with that, I'd like to stop and see if there are any questions. And thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Greg. I'm sure there's a lot of excitement now that you mentioned the Socrates 2. I'm sure excited to hear about that. I have one question so far, and that's from Christina McCluskey. And she asks, great to see so much coming out of the source studies. Thank you for sharing with us. My question is in regard to the comparison between regions south and north of 60 degrees south.
Okay.
Have you looked at how the cloud phase, liquid, mixed, or ice, compares between the 2 regions?
Well, we have done some very preliminary investigations of that. Those data from Marcus were actually very difficult to work with because anybody who was on the ship could probably tell you that a cruise over the Southern Ocean is not terribly luxurious. There's a lot of pitch and roll, so there's a lot of corrections that need to be done to the data. Unfortunately, the stabilized platform always did not work. The ARM folks have done a lot of work in doing that. So in order to answer that question, we also need a secondary level of retrievals, which Raj Marchand has been working on. He's completed a lot of those retrievals from the MacQuarie campaign, and he finally now has them from the Marcus campaign. So we're starting to go through them now. I would say the one thing is we know that there is a lot more supercooled water over the Southern Ocean. We're just seeing that from looking at the cloud-based temperatures. But we're really now just getting to the stage where we have the really good retrievals from Raj to work with, where we can better answer that question. Great question, Christine.
So I have another question here, which asks, you show that the sulfur containing particles dominate aerosol numbers. Do you have data for the compositions of these particles and any indication of the presence of organics and ammonium?
Well, that is one area, you know, I'll go back, and unfortunately, this is probably the one area where I'm not as much of an expert, and I wish that Cindy was actually present in the audience, but I'll go back to, whoops, I think I went back too far. Go back to Cindy's observations here. So basically, the information I have really is from, you know, we did not have as great of an observation like to have a mass spectrometer on board or anything like that that would have given us better information than what we have. And that's something that I hope we can do more with Socrates 2. So basically, all that I can really answer here in this case is what Cindy has told me from her analysis, that it's sulfur-based particles primarily biogenically produce sulfuric acid. And for more details than that, I would really need to refer to Cindy, who's the one who's been doing much of this analysis.
Okay, thank you. So we have 2 more questions. One is from Holger Wilmer, and he asks, you showed thin layers of supercooled clouds from HSRL at the top of the clouds. At the same time, it looks like HSRL may be may penetrate deep into these clouds. Is it possible that HSRL gives a false impression of layers when in fact there may be multiple layers or even much thicker layers underneath which HSRL can't see?
That's a very good question, Holger. And actually, we are using our understanding from many of these flights that we also gained from the vertical profiling that we did with the G5. So probably equally as important in my conclusion that a lot of these clouds are very thin comes from the observations that we saw with the G5, where we could see these very thin liquid layers. At times, yes, there were much thicker layers that the HSRL could not penetrate. So there was a couple days where we were flying and from what we were seeing with the radar in combination with the LiDAR, there are parts that we were not willing to take the G5 into. I think Julie was with me on one of those flights where we felt that the icing potential would be too great to actually take the aircraft into that particular day. So certainly the HSRL data by themselves don't really adequately answer that question, because sometimes they penetrate these layers and you can see two layers. Sometimes you see a thin layer. That may be the fact that it is not penetrating. So you really need to use the HSRL in combination with other information. And since Holger asked, I'm going to switch to one of the slides that was Jeff's contribution that he put together, showing some of the benefit of having the combination of the in situ and remote sensing observations. So most of these plots I'm showing you, by the way, are from an overview paper that we're applying. So this is one of the examples where you can use some of the remote sensing observations. This is from one flight. And you can see in this particular flight in the upper 100 meters of the cloud, you're in exclusively smaller droplets as measured by the CDP probe. And if you're looking at the concentration of droplets from the 2DS, they're very low. But you work a bit lower down into the cloud, then you can see there's more of a mixture of the drizzle droplets and the small drops. And here we're looking at some of the phase characterization from the remote sensing data. So ultimately, you really need to use these data in greater putting all the data sets together to well answer that question. So nice question, Holger.
So we have actually, so Scott Ellis sent in two questions, but the first one is actually basically the same that Holger asked. So I will just ask you the second question, which is, could the estimate of the width of the generating cells possibly be underestimated by not knowing if the aircraft transected the center of the generating cells?
The answer to that is absolutely yes. The key thing there is because we are just looking at it in one dimension. And I think the plots, I'd like to show the photo that Joe Finland took. We're just going in one direction, okay? So whatever the width, we're defining the width is whatever cross section we took there. And is the chance that we went through the widest part of the cloud to get the width? Absolutely not. We could have been going through the sides at some time, more to the side of the cloud. So yes, it is definitely underestimated. One interesting question to ask is, because we were basically always flying in a north-south direction or at some different angle, another fair question would be, are we biased by the fact that we're always taking one angle? And looking at this picture here, I'd be hard pressed to say that we were biased by the fact that we were always flying in more or less a north-south direction, but certainly we're underestimating because we always don't go through the peak part of the cloud. But note that the other data sets I were comparing against, the Arctic and the mid-latitude, we made those estimates the same way from just whatever direction we were moving in. So I do believe that although that statistic of 400 meters is probably an underestimate, I believe the comparison versus the Arctic and mid-latitudes is probably a robust conclusion. Thanks, Scott.
That was the last question so far. Yeah, so thank you very much for this very, very interesting presentation. I'm completely overwhelmed by all this data that was collected in these different field campaigns, and to bring it all together is just really exciting to see. So yeah, and I also would like to thank you very much for being our guinea pig for this remote format that we now have. I think it worked out pretty well, and yeah, thank you very much for all your hard work putting these field campaigns together, and also, of course, giving the presentation today.
Okay, you're very welcome. And I look forward when this whole situation mitigates, I look forward to an actual face-to-face visit in EOL where I can also talk and interact with people.
Yes, we look forward to that very much too. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks all, and bye all.
Bye.